I've been asked to talk a little bit about what resilience means to Engineers Without Borders. Now, resilience is often seen through the lens of disaster relief. Of how do you cope with shocks and stresses? We're an international development organisation. We're not REDAR, a disaster relief organisation, although we do have many members who go on to work in disaster relief. So I was thinking a little bit about this, and I think, as with everything at Engineers Without Borders, it's all about people. It's always all about people. And what we try to do at Engineers Without Borders is to get people to think outside their little box. Not so little, actually, in many cases, many of these disciplines. So working across different disciplines, working with other people, and from some of the entries you've submitted today, you can see that a lot of you have thought about different disciplines and different aspects. We've heard about that as well. But people, engineers, built environment professionals, people who make cities, who are good at working with things, but we also need these people to be good at working with people. And Robert Chambers, who's a bit of an international development guru, describes this, he's a social scientist, describes it as what the world needs is people who can combine neo-Newtonian practice, which is often what we get taught, and the way we get taught at universities in our professions, very sort of linear analytical. We need to combine that sort of practice, neo-Newtonian practice, with adaptive pluralism. And some of the photos, I think, that you showed there, showed people who had to be very, very adaptive and take a multitude of different approaches to finding solutions to get through their lives. Resilience is about being excellent at listening and being excellent at communicating. And because that way you can share skills, from, the person designing the city to the client, the people who live in the city, so they can take care of it themselves. And building up that capacity is really important, a really important part of international development work. It's actually about values. It's about what you value in your work and what you think is important in your work. And I think some of the philosophy that Ove Arup himself was espousing, actually is an inspiration to a lot of the people here who think about these issues. And I think one of the things about my sort of main constituency at Engineers Without Borders is that they're students, and students tend to be very rooted in the communities where they live. The universities may be cut off from the rest of the community in some cases, but they're very rooted in the university community itself. And that's a really big part of resilience, of having people to call on. And this is something I experience every day. Something somewhere just needs a little bit of extra help. So somebody contacts me and asks me, and I have to kind of find somebody's phone number, and there's always something going on. And being able to have that community support is really important. We have an entire list of attributes of what we think an engineer without borders is. Somebody, who has all of these sorts of qualities. And it was actually Katie here in the audience who, when she was working for us as a member of staff, who pulled that work together. And we'll be sharing a website with everybody, in fact, very soon, that will allow you to feed back on that. So watch that space. Anyway. But resilience is about technology too, and the kind of technology we choose to work with. There is perhaps a feeling that the technologies that are used in developing communities, developing countries, is inferior to the technology that is used in the UK. And it's actually, you've got to think about the context. Context is absolutely key in international development work. And you've got to think about the context in which it's used. So, From Joe's excellent Brunel lecture, which I recommend to you all, there was an example from Ho Chi Minh City, where the choice was essentially, do we use a series of small sewers, or do we use one big sewer? In London, the super sewer may be an appropriate solution. The super sewer under the Thames may be an appropriate solution for this city. But the danger is that that might set an example to other cities around the world about how they have to solve their sanitation problems. And we've got to remember that context is king. So in a lot of our work, the technology we deal with in Engineers Without Borders is people-sized, because then people can fix it and maintain it themselves, and understand it and appreciate and enjoy it. I'll give you a few examples. We're working with IRRI, the Renewable Resources Institute, for the first time in Mexico this summer, and it's on rainwater harvesting, urban rainwater harvesting. So retrofitting rainwater harvesting tanks to buildings in Mexico City, one of the largest cities on Earth. And water supply is a big problem in Mexico City. I mean, it's quite famous for the subsidence in parts of the city, but the land has sunk so much because the aquifer's been depleted. So using rainwater harvesting systems to supplement their water supply. I don't actually understand why we don't do that in London. You know, we have aquifer, drought problems around here. Why aren't we collecting rainwater? We seem to have enough of it in June. What's going on? You know? So that's going to be a really interesting project. With Shelter Associates and Pune, we are continuing some work that we've been doing to map the slums in the city for the first time. So we're working with Shelter Associates, and Ellie here was on a placement with them a few years ago. And we're working with them to convert their surveys into a Google Earth layer. So for the first time, the city government has a map of where its population lives and what each of these households in its slums are up to. What the purpose of the household is, whether it's a shop or a residence. In El Salvador, we've been doing some quite interesting work with Redes, our partner out there, on retrofitting adobe buildings with essentially canes and bits of wire, creating a cage around the walls of the buildings to reduce the risk of collapse of the walls, during the regular small and medium earthquakes that get in El Salvador. But you've got to keep people in mind at all times, because we spent a long time trying to come up with or find a technology which could be affordable. So we're trying everything we could to avoid using concrete in strengthening these adobe homes, these people's houses. And we got to the end of the project. A number of homes were retrofitted, and we found that the people in the community had actually started using concrete to put a skim over their houses because, we'd spent all this time trying to avoid using concrete, and there they were using it. And the reason was they'd worked with a Western engineer, a member of Engineers Without Borders, and they wanted their houses to look like our houses. We set the example. So we have to think about the way we do things here. And then on the electricity side of things, we're doing some PhD research work at, supporting a PhD researcher at Bristol University called Sam Williamson, who's looking at the large-scale manufacture of picohydro devices. But what's getting even more interesting about that, the device itself is just a piece of technology. The really interesting part of it is that he's developing a system for creating mini-grids within communities so that if one of these devices fails in a particular household, or somebody, does something silly like plugs in a kettle, and there's more energy required, the mini-grid will be able to cope with that within these communities. So, we're not very good yet at working in cities. International development organizations generally aren't. It is the domain of the built environment professional, certainly in the private sector, but in the not-for-profit sector, we're not so good at working in cities yet, but it is where the challenge lies over the next 20 years. And I think even in cities, we need to be talking about smaller solutions. Schumacher Fritz Schumacher, who wrote Small is Beautiful, said that we have to overcome our fascination with giantism. You know, we see these documentaries on TV about, you know, the biggest skyscrapers or all of these big tunnels, all of these amazing engineering achievements. But I think we need to celebrate the small a little bit more. Key point is, I think resilience is about keeping people in mind at all times. Thank you so much for participating in this competition.
I'd like to finish and encourage you to enjoy the rest of the evening. I would like to challenge you to speak to at least 3 new people that you haven't met yet. There's a lot of bright minds in the room, and we've seen from some of the presentations there's a lot of new ideas that I think we haven't come across before, or offer them from a different perspective. So enjoy your evening, help yourself to food and to drink, and enjoy meeting new people. Thank you very much.